Hey there, welcome to the stream. I'm Josh Rushing, sitting in for Femi OK today. Now, look, if you're watching this live on YouTube, I want you to help me out. See that box over there? That is a live YouTube chat, and we have a producer sitting there waiting to get your questions and your comments to me so that I can ask them during the show today. And what a show it is. We're talking about war. Now, that's the title and the subject of one of the hottest books of 2020. It got picked as a top 10 book by the New York Times for nonfiction, and we're lucky enough to be joined by its author, Margaret MacMillan. Professor MacMillan is a professor of history at the University of Toronto and an emeritus professor of international history and the former warden of St. Anthony's College at the University of Oxford. And Oxford is where she's joining us from today. Good day, Professor. How are you?
Very well, thanks.
All right, so let's start with the book. You've written a lot of books about the 20th century, and then you wrote this one, which is a course about the 20th century, which is known for these great wars, but it's actually a much more broad look at history on this one topic of war. Why did you write it? I'm also curious, are you surprised at all by the response to it?
Well, the second question is easy to answer. Yes, I am. It's something I've been thinking about for a long time, but I thought it will come out. It's a book that a few people might like. It'd be nice if it got some nice reviews, but I am surprised. It's something I've been thinking about for a long time. If you do history, war comes in and out of history a lot. It has a huge impact on history. And I suppose war was in my own background, like it's in the background of a lot of people my age. My father was in the Canadian Navy, in the Second World War. Both my grandfathers were in the First World War as doctors. And so it was something I heard about as a child. And for some reason, it's a subject, the whole subject of war through the ages is something that has always fascinated me.
It's interesting because every history book I've ever read, war is a prevalent part of it, but the book isn't just about war. Are there a category of human experiences that you might put on this same level, like love or sex or economy, or like in what kind of category are you placing war in terms of human experience?
War is one of the great challenging experiences for humans, I suppose. It brings out both the best and the worst in human nature. It can have a profound impact on societies, or it can be something that's fought somewhere else by other people, and we don't think about it very much. But I think it intensifies what it is to be human. I mean, in war, you're faced with, well, you've been in war, so you know better than me. You're faced with the most elemental decisions. You have to try and save your life. You might have to try and take another life. You do things for other people that you might not do in peacetime. And so it is something, I think, which is not natural to us necessarily, but it is an enormously testing part of what it is to be human.
You know, talking about not natural, my most not natural experience of war, which I've been to many, many times as a journalist and only once as a Marine, is as a Marine, you have a reason that you're there, a purpose, be it just or unjust, but you definitely know why you're there. As a journalist, when you're there, obviously you're there, it's important to witness it, but at the same time, you feel foolish finding yourself in that kind of, like, who finds himself on a battlefield without a weapon? It's just a weird thing. And you ask yourself these questions like, what am I doing here? But you document in your book, through time, people being on the battlefield with cameras when they first were there with cameras. And what have you found about the way people reflect on war?
Well, I think it depends whether you're there as an observer. And I think if you're only there as an observer, I mean, of course, your life is in danger and you're part of it in some ways, but you aren't fighting. And so you're not experiencing it in the same way. And what I'm very conscious of is I'll never really understand what it is to be in combat. And what I try and do is read about it, look at pictures about it. And I think the soldiers, those who fight themselves, have often tried to capture that. In the 20th century, they wrote memoirs. And then when cheap cameras came, in the First World War, it was possible for a soldier to carry a very small, cheap camera in the pocket of his uniform. They tried, I think, to record it as much as they could in their own ways, because I think they probably sensed this was something they wanted, if not to remember fondly, but to capture, because it was such a crisis moment in their lives.
We have a question for you from someone from our community. This is Caroline Ball. She's an academic librarian in Derby, and she has a question about Steven Pinker's book, which you've mentioned a few times in your book. Here, I'll let her ask it.
Several times in this book, you mention Steven Pinker. and his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, in which he argues that violence has declined in human societies throughout history. And I wonder, having written this book that focuses exclusively on war, what you think about that argument. Are we listening to the better angels of our nature and becoming less violent? Or are we perhaps staying the same, or maybe even becoming more violent? I wonder what you think about that.
Steven Pinker's book is enormously challenging and I think very important. But I would make a distinction. I've been thinking about it a lot since I've read it, and I've read other books which take issue with him. And what I would say is that we may be becoming, in some societies, less prone to random violence or less prone to use violence in our everyday lives. I mean, we don't expect people to come outside pubs anymore and brawl, and we disapprove of it if that happens, and it used to happen a lot more. And we don't enjoy public executions or public displays of cruelty. So I think in some ways, perhaps the better angels of our natures, at least in some societies, have won out. But war is quite different. It's not random violence. War is organized violence. And you can take someone who is perfectly peaceful and doesn't want to kill anyone else and turn that person into someone who is a disciplined warrior who will do it. And I think the crucial thing about war is that it's organized. And in some ways, the violence exerted in war, yes, there is violence in war, but the violence exerted in war is purposive, it's intentional. And sometimes I think it's a great deal more devastating and cruel than the random violence when we just lash out.
But are you making the argument that you think Pinker is wrong in his central argument that these are the least violent times in human history?
I think it depends what you're talking about. If you're talking about certain societies, yes, they are enjoying less violent times. Although, I mean, there are exceptions. His own country, the United States, has one of the highest homicide rates in the world. It's way out on the end of one scale for most of the developed world. But what I think about war is it's not that sort of violence. It uses violence as an element, but war is highly organized. And anthropologists said to me, and I've been thinking about it ever since, war is the most organized of all human activities. And you apply violence in war, but you do it often in a very cold and calculating way. And so war is not the same as the violence that you might see in societies where violence is endemic, where people are used to beating each other up and trying to kill each other or simply being cruel to each other. War is organized, purposive violence. And so I would say that in some ways we may be getting nicer, but we still have a tremendous capacity to organize ourselves for destruction and for killing others.
Can you talk to us about how war has shaped culture? I really enjoyed the last chapter of your book. And you think about it going all the way back to Homer and the Iliad through Picasso and Guernica, or all the great writing that came out of World War I. Can you just, I don't know if that's fully appreciated as much as perhaps it should be.
I think war does two things with culture. One is that war provokes a response in people of great creativity, and they try and make sense of it. I mean, some of the great writing that came out of the First World War was those who were engaged in that war trying to make sense of the war itself, of this tremendous industrial killing machine which Europe had built. And painters and musicians as well, I think, try and make sense of war. They try and understand it because it's such a challenge to our understanding of who we are and what we are. And so war, I think, will provoke among great artists a very thoughtful and often passionate response. When you think of Picasso's Guernica, that extraordinary painting he did after the Italian Air Force bombed a defenseless Basque town in the Spanish Civil War, one of the first times that civilians had been bombed from the air. And it caused a tremendous response and produced one of the great paintings of the 20th century. But culture also shapes the way in which we look at war. And we know that culture can react to the horrors of war and portray them, but cultural artifacts can also try and portray war as something glorious. And the portrayal of war as something glorious, I mean, it's there in the Iliad, even though the horror of war is there as well, has also influenced people in their attitudes towards war. Many of the young soldiers who went off to fight in the First World War, particularly from the middle and upper classes, had been educated on the classics, and they thought they were going off to fight a noble war, like the Trojan Wars or like the Roman Wars. And so it works both ways. War will produce cultural responses and cultural creations, but those creations in some cases can also help shape our attitudes to wars and help make us perhaps readier to fight in some cases.
There's also something in that about the way that we remember war. I want to bring in another comment. This is from an associate professor of history at UVA down in Charlottesville, Virginia, named Jennifer Sessions.
One really important impact of war on society is how war is remembered and how memories of war are used politically in the present. If we take the imperial wars that Europeans and Americans fought in the 18 and 1900s, for instance, whether you see them now as instances of national glory or racist violence is really about what empire means to you today and how it relates to your contemporary values. Who we see as the heroes and the villains of wars of the past is as much about who we identify with in the present as it is about what happened historically. When we look at the fights about monuments that have been going on over the last couple of years, American Civil War monuments, European colonial monuments, this is what's really going on.
I think that's very true, and I think it's true of history in general, that we are constantly reshaping our views of the past and asking different questions of it, depending on what we're preoccupied with in the present and what concerns we have about ourselves. I think I quite agree.
So when you look at the debate happening in the United States over the Civil War monuments, what's your takeaway from that? What does history tell us about that debate?
Well, how we look at monuments changes, and a lot of those Civil War monuments were put up. Actually, I hadn't realized how recent some of them were. Some of them were put up in the 50s when the civil rights movement was beginning to get going, and I think they were put up very deliberately by white supremacists in the United States to show that we won and you lost, and to the Black Americans, and you had better watch it. And now, of course, as American society is coming to terms with its own racism and with the tensions between the races, those monuments, again, are being seen in a different light. And I think this happens a lot, that how we see things is very much affected by what's happening to us today. And I think it's quite right and proper that we should question such things as we question our histories.
Why does it seem normal that every country on earth needs to train some of its young people to be killers? And not unrestrained killers, but some kind of control killers, where it's okay to kill here and then, but not here and now. How is that normalized?
Well, it's partly fear, I think. It's fear that if we don't prepare ourselves, others might attack us. I think fear plays a very large part in preparations for war and thinking about war, and always has done. But there are those who believe and have believed that training people to be ready to fight is actually good for the nation. It helps to be, it's a mark of a nation's strength. It's good for young people to be given discipline. I mean, that was quite prevalent in a lot of European countries, for example, before the First World War, that somehow military virtues were what you wanted. Discipline, willingness to sacrifice, willingness to die for your country or for whatever cause. And so I think there are a number of things that drive societies to prepare for war. And one is clearly fear, but sometimes there are those in societies who say we need to get ready because we may want to fight a war to take what we want. The Japanese militarists before the Second World War believed in a strong armed forces so they could seize more land on the mainland of China, so they could make a stronger Japan. And so there are many motives for wars and many reasons why peoples do prepare to fight them.
There's some interesting parts of the book where you talk about the technological advancements that have come from war, all the way from stirrups to silk shirts to steel ships and airplanes. We actually have a comment from, this is from a professor of history in Florence, Italy. Here, check this out.
Now, the richest societies on Earth are fast approaching the moment when they will be able to wage war almost entirely by machines and automated systems without exposing their own men and women to the destruction of the battlefield. So how will this change war, the propensity of our societies to wage war, and the huge differential between the richest and the poorest society on Earth in this uneven relationship? I think this is the question, and I don't see any comforting answer to these questions.
I want to add to that from our YouTube community. Didi Amelia says the West has made war worse than it was. People used to fight with swords on a battlefield without children, without women and innocent men. The Western world has added fuel to the fire, causing this. And so she's talking about the advancement of war and war becoming worse. And also, I'd add one more thing. Have you noticed the recent drone war that happened in Azerbaijan with Armenia? Yeah. Their use of drones for military writers are saying this signals a new age of warfare. But go ahead if you wanted to comment about what the video comment was.
Well, I thought the first remark was very good, and I too am pessimistic, because what's happening is it's possible to wage war at a great distance on people you never see or people you never engage with, and that may make the waging of war much easier. I mean, so much of the war that has happened in the world since 1945, not all, but a lot of it has been powers fighting well away from their own territory, sending their armed forces abroad. And it's been possible for people in countries like the United States or Canada, my own country, or Britain, to see war as something that others do and happens elsewhere. And I think that is very, very dangerous. And I do worry about the growth of artificial intelligence in war, the growth of self-guiding machines in war. And I think that is really a worry. I think developed nations who want to wage that sort of war, however, will find that war may come to them. One of the things that the military in developed countries are worrying a lot about now, and they rightly should, is urban warfare and the possibility for small urban guerrillas or small groups of people, often self-recruited, to wage war even on very powerful countries. So I think I see the future of war as moving both in the very high-tech level and often far away from the countries that are waging war, but also war of a low level, which will cause a great deal of misery. As far as the West being responsible for using technology in war, I think it's not just the West. Any peoples that has come across a new technology has, I think, thought about how it might be used for war. The Mongols learned that the horse could be useful in war. It made them very effective warriors, and they learned how to make very, very powerful composite bows. Developments in steel, the production of steel, was a great help to some of the armies that rampaged through the Middle East. So that I don't think the West has certainly in recent centuries been responsible for a great deal of the technological advance in war, and indeed for a great deal of the destruction of war. But it is, I think, something that is throughout human history. When a new technology comes along, societies have often wanted to see how they can use it for war. And that, I think, is pretty much something that is part of humanity.
You know, for what I saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, I wouldn't be surprised if you told me that the U.S. deployed more laptops and computers to those war zones than they did guns. I mean, it's really a signal that the information age. And it reminds me of that quote from your book about Rommel, saying that the war is fought by quartermasters long before the battle begins. I think, you know, so much is put toward that kind of controlling and understanding information and logistics and supplies and all that. But what happened in Azerbaijan, which I just hinted at, is that this thing had been in a stalemate between these two territories for, you know, like 20 or 30 years. And then they came in with a bunch of drones, and within a month were able to force the Armenians into really a terrible compromise. And it was because of drone technology. So when you can do that without risking the lives of the young people from your country, there becomes a disconnect between the political will that's required for politicians to conduct war and actually doing it. Are there examples of that historically, that where countries were maybe able to pay mercenaries to fight wars for them so that they didn't require the political will of their people?
Well, mercenary wars have been common throughout history, and mercenaries have often come, understandably, from the poorest parts of the world because it's a way out. In the wars in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, the mercenaries came from places like Switzerland, Ireland, Scotland, because those were the poorer parts of Europe, and young men didn't have much opportunity in life, and war gave them at least a chance to leave and possibly to survive and possibly to get on in the world. But I think what we've also seen is always a search for, particularly in developed societies, for types of technology that will enable you to spare the lives of your own men. I mean, there was great hope after the First World War that the airplane would make mass armies on the ground unnecessary, and that it would be possible to wage war at a distance using machines. And I think this is something that societies keep on looking for, the sort of solution that will enable them to get the edge over their enemies and not have to sacrifice their lives of their young people. And I think what's also happening, and it happens, you know, in different societies at different times, is a number of societies no longer are willing to see their young people sacrificed in war. I think the First and Second World War had a huge impact on the public opinion in the countries that fought them. And I think in many countries there's a real distaste now for risking the lives of those they would have risked in the past.
We have another comment from someone in our YouTube community right now. It is nationalism the main cause of modern acceleration of war? I know nationalism played a big role in the great wars of the 20th century, and now we see nationalism on the rise again with people like Trump and Bolsonaro and Brexit. Is this a canary in the coal mine that we should be watching for?
I think nationalism has been a factor in war. I mean, it very much from the end of the 18th century onwards. Before that, most peoples did not organize themselves or identify themselves as being part of national groups, but they did begin to do so. And nationalism, as we know, is a very powerful force. It's like a religion in a way, that people will do it for the sake of something that they see as much bigger than them, much more important than them, which will outlive them. And people are prepared to sacrifice and die for this thing called the nation. It's enormously important as a way of identifying ourselves. And I do worry, because what nationalism so often does is not just say we're a people and bring us together. It also points out those who are excluded. It draws a line and it says they're not part of us and they're our enemy. And so nationalism tends to want to find opponents and tends to want to find enemies, and therefore I think is very dangerous. And we're seeing, I think, a rise of nationalisms around the world, which I do think are potentially very dangerous indeed. I mean, the recent clash in the high mountains between India and China engaged nationalist passions in both countries, and there was a tendency to look on the other, the people on the other side, as somehow your mortal enemy who would have to be confronted. So yes, I agree with the questioner.
Margaret, what's your favorite book on war? Now that I've read your book, what's the next one you'd recommend to me?
Well, I'd start with the Iliad, because it is both a masterpiece and a foundation, I think, of world literature. But it also brings out the horror and yet the fatal attraction of war. You know, Achilles is this great warrior, and he's terrifying and in some ways inhuman, but he's also greatly admired. And so I think I'd start with that. But I think it's hard to list all the things I think are wonderful. I tend to like the novels and the works of literature, because they seem to me to capture something about war.
I noticed you leaned on Tim O'Brien's The Things We Carried a lot. That's an excellent one. My favorite is We Die Alone, about the Norwegian guy, Jan Balsrud. I think I'm mispronouncing his name, Jan Balsrud. Have you read that book, We Die Alone?
I haven't. No, I will make a note, because I'm a great admirer of Tim O'Brien, that American novelist. I mean, I think his description in Vietnam and in the things they carried of what the soldiers went through, but he also gets at something which I think is a very important component of war, and that's the camaraderie. That's the feeling that those who are fighting have for each other. And I think he gets that very well indeed. I think it's a wonderful book.
What will people remember, say 200, 300 years from now? What will be remembered about the 20th century?
If we're still
and
around.
What will be left to the dustbins of history, as Tolstoy said?
Well, I think people will look back at the 20th century as they're already looking back at saying, what an extraordinary century. I mean, in some ways, such great progress, enormous scientific and technological advances, social advances, not uniform, but certainly changes, often for the better in societies, and also what horrors it produced. How could this century have encompassed so much that was good about humanity and so much that was bad? How could it have produced these hideous dictatorships, the Nazi dictatorship, the Soviet dictatorship, a whole host of other dictatorships, Mao's dictatorship, totalitarian states? How could it have improved the lives of so many people and also introduced killing on a mass scale? It's one of the most bloody centuries, I think, in human history, and yet it has this paradox that it also produced tremendous advances. And advances in the way we think about each other, advances in human rights, advances in the sense of a common humanity. I don't know how people in the future will characterize the 20th century. I think it will continue to be this extraordinary puzzle.
Yeah, Buzz Aldrin once told me that, hundreds of years from now, look back on the 20th century, the only thing that will be remembered is World War II and landing on the moon. Real quick, I got less than a minute, but I want to know, if you had a nephew come to you and say they were thinking about joining the military, or a niece, in less than a minute, what would you advise them?
Go and read about it. Read the memoirs of those who fought. If this is what you want, and there are very good things about being in the military, yes, you will get an education. You'll learn a lot from your people you meet. You'll meet some wonderful people. But remember that at base, what you're doing is preparing, if necessary, to kill others and be killed.
Sage advice, Margaret. And they could definitely pick worse places and start than your book, War. That's what I'd recommend. Start there and visit a VA hospital, maybe. Margaret, thank you for the time today. And everyone in our audience, thank you. I'll see you next time.